Welcome everyone to Ruslan Bortnik YouTube channel in English. Today we have a quite different concept that we've had for the past few months. Of course, we're going to have Ruslan today with us as well. We all know Ruslan, so we don't have to introduce him for too long, but Ruslan is a political expert, political scientist, and the director of the Ukrainian Institute of Politics. And as well, we have today Professor Eric Bronner that has joined us to discuss future resolutions or potential resolutions that at the moment different mediators are working to solve the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. I want to welcome both of you to today's panel discussion.
Hello, James.
Hello, James. And hello, Ruslan.
Hello, Steven.
Professor Bronner, I've read your bio and the resume, and I looked at some works that you've done, and you seem a go-to person to talk about the armed conflicts and how they've been resolved. So I want to specifically focus today on armed conflicts, wars, and just in general everything that we have seen happening after the end of the Cold War and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and take that as a time frame from then till now, how things were developing. If we're using that background, how do you think the Ukrainian-Russian conflict is different between everything that we've had up until then? Like the Middle Eastern conflict, the Balkan conflicts, all the war, how is the Ukrainian-Russian war is different from everything that we've seen up until then?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate it very much, and I always enjoy being in a discussion with my friend Ruslan Bortnik, whom I really respect very much. So I guess I would begin in the following way. If we go back to 1989, the idea that gripped the United States and much of the West was the idea of the end of history. This was the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, and there was an avalanche of work coming out that attacked the idea of revolution and that basically made the assumption in sort of a caricature of Hegel's notion of the end of history. Hegel, the great philosopher, 19th century philosopher, who developed the idea of the end of history and the idea that the great battles had already been fought. That's the key point. Basically, with the collapse of communism, it was simply assumed that America had won, or that the West had won the Cold War, and that all future conflicts would basically be economic in character. They wouldn't be political. They wouldn't deal with ideological issues. That there was the assumption that all political issues would become translated into administrative, bureaucratic issues, legislative issues, and thus open to compromise. The other, what's also interesting about this view, as put forward by a Harvard-trained political theorist, Francis Fukuyama, was that heroism would vanish, that we would have a kind of mediocrity. Fukuyama associated it with Nietzsche's idea of the last man, and the idea of that what we'll have is a mediocre, self-interested individual emerge that would be bereft of ideology, bereft of heroism, and would be simply concerned with his or her own pocketbook. I don't know whether this is psychologically true. I would suggest that the idea of possessive individualism goes back to the beginning of capitalism. There's nothing new about that. The other parts of the argument, I think, are blatantly wrong and shows, in a certain way, the kind of assumptions that led to, if I can put it this way, a misevaluation of the important conflicts that emerged afterwards. And that doesn't matter whether it's in the Middle East or it's Eastern Europe, or Africa, or Asia. Heroism obviously is still on the agenda. The Ukrainians have shown that, but it may be taking a different form. If we think of, some of you may remember that lone gentleman in a business suit and a briefcase in Tiananmen Square standing in front of a tank. That's the symbol, I think, that of heroism in our time. And it seems to me this is something that obviously the Ukrainian citizenry has shown against the Russians, but also I think that we have in the West underestimated, in a certain, maybe that's the wrong word, taken for granted our own commitment to liberal republicanism. It's become clear that this is can no longer be taken for granted as the goal of movements throughout the world. I mean, obviously, religious extremism in the Middle East, but also, how should I say, the acceptance, sort of the kind of cynical acceptance that has taken place with regard to authoritarian regimes and the normalization of extremism in certainly in the West, but I guess also in the East as well. I guess the final point I would make in this regard is we tend to make too much, I think, in international affairs. I know this sounds somewhat strange, but I think we underestimate the role of ideology, and we underestimate the importance of geopolitical issues in favor of pure economics. These assumptions, I think, made us underestimate the severity and depth of the crisis that we're experiencing today.
You know, I think, at least for me, it looks like, the West, after the end of the Cold War, when they have, just like you said, they've made an assumption that now things going to go into more diplomatic and more like we're going to have a lot of bureaucracy, but we wouldn't have any some sort of warm conflicts where we have another ideology rising, or we're going to reduce the level of heroism, so we're not going to see anything extremist. But I still want to break it down into things were still rolling for the West pretty well up until the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. They could have still hide behind those, pink glasses and say, well, it's still very manageable. We can still come in and we can still negotiate a potential peaceful resolution, and we can still pressure on both sides of the conflict to stop it whenever it's convenient or whenever we think it's enough. Or I might be wrong. And it seems to be with the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, we've got into a new chapter when the West is no longer capable of coming into the picture and saying, you know what, we've played the game, but it's time to stop. It's not up to them anymore to stop conflicts the way they've used to before this specific Russian-Ukrainian war. Do you see that difference between what we had before the Russian-Ukrainian war and or it's similar, or we can apply similar strategies to resolution of those conflicts?
I think I wouldn't put it this way. I don't think the no offense intended. I don't think the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is the break. I think the break came with the attack on the World Trade Center and the war on terror. And I think by 2000, you could really, this was really palpable, and certainly in the United States, that the idea of, a, shall we say, a moderate or realistic conservatism and an old-fashioned political realism had basically evaporated. You have to think to yourself, with the attack on the World Trade Center and the United States' response, the war on terror, the failure of the war on terror, the failure of the Afghani experiment, certainly the Great Depression of 2008. You put this together, and the neoconservative approach, which basically said we are able to intervene in the name of regime change in our direction, right? In a Republican, in a Republican way, regime change in a Republican way. We can go in there, and the world wants us. I think that came to an end then. There was a very famous situation that came about with regard to Iraq.
Yes, sir.
With regard to Iraq, in which it was assumed through influential exiles, such as Ahmed Shalabi, but also through mainstream media, like the New York Times and Washington Post, that the Iraqi people were just waiting for the United States to invade. There were all kinds of newsreels and photos and so on. And Shalabi himself ran for president. He said he would be the, shall we say, the Zelensky of his country. He would bring in he would have a majority of support behind him, and he wound up with 2% of the vote. We were not able to, the United States was not able to control, and the West was not able to control events in Iraq, in Syria. And we were even taken by surprise with regard to the Arab Spring, which really showed how, or at least it taught me, because I was in certain areas of the Middle East at that time. It showed me how precious the liberal republic as an institution was to people, how they were willing to go out into the streets in circumstances which were arguably even more dangerous than in 1989 for in the name of democracy, and that there is a root conflict. And let me put it to you this way: here's what I see: that there is transnationally a root conflict between the tradition of the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment political ideals and the counter-Enlightenment and anti, if you like, liberal socialist ideals. Tragically, this is not taken seriously enough by postmodern academicians who identify themselves as progressives. I think there's a line in the sand that has presented itself which contradicts the end of history thesis, but also should inform our understanding of contemporary events. That's not to say that, every place there is a dictatorship, the West should invade. But I think every place there is a dictatorship or a dictator or an authoritarian bloc forming, the shall we say progressive forces have to have a proactive rather than a reactive strategy.
So here's what I understand from what you're saying is that the breaking point happened when we had the Great Depression, as you called it, in 2008, and the terror attack on the trade towers. If we're using that as a breakpoint, do you think authoritarian regimes saw that as the end of that part that the West describes as the end of the history? Maybe that was the time of that little part of the end of the history from 1809 to 2008 or 2011. And from there, we have seen a new chapter where new blocks and new regimes started forming, and they saw this as an opportunity to.
That's a very interesting question, actually. I can say this much, that within in the West, and you can really see this in the United States, that by 2008, what we consider today the moderate regime of George W. Bush, this was over. And it was, I don't even know how radically I can say, well, maybe I can put it this way. It ideologically ran out of gas as surely as the old Soviet regime ran out of gas at the end. I mean, people just didn't believe it anymore. There was an ideological vacuum, and that vacuum was filled in the Republican Party by the ultra-right, by the extremists, by the Tea Party at that point. And the Tea Party morphed into the foundation for Donald Trump's people. It's very interesting with the way you put this, though, from the standpoint of the authoritarian regimes. Let me put it this way. My assumption, I guess, is they probably thought that shall we say, the moderate consensus in the United States, we call it the vital center, was imperiled, and that there were new opportunities. I'm saying this for extremists generally.
Yeah, they saw it as an opportunity.
Yeah, to capitalize on this. And I think you saw this in Western Europe and in the United States, certainly among far-right organizations, and also in the Middle East, I would think. I think that's true what you say. In the Middle East, there was also an attempt to capitalize on this. And that has been, I think, relatively successful.
It's also, I just want to, I've read your article.
Very good point, actually, what you raised.
And I want to go back to the Ukrainian-Russian conflict and see how
may I add something, because it's very interesting part of discussion. For me, it looks sometimes the West became the hostage of its own self-propaganda or something like this. They believed in the end of the history. They believed of the victory of the democracy, of eternal victory of the democracy. And they believed that there are no very significant enemy or even competitor in the world, only a small terrorists, small groups, some marginalized countries, and that's all. There is no big enemy. So this disappear of this enemy and will lead to West to the losing of the ideology. And we're talking about the liberal and Republicans at the same time. So this was the results why for example, climate questions or became so important. I'm talking about the public discussion because this question is very extremely important, but it was overestimated if we are talking about the tactic in this way. And in this situation, Western societies of prosperity, of welfare, they are still living in a peace situation. They are still living in the peace environment. They are not recognizing their risks and dangers of the future. Yeah, but another way, I'm not talking about Ukrainian society, I'm talking about the global South societies. They are not, even if we are talking about the countries which are not in the war now, their societies are living like they are in the war. They are not just living, they are fighting for development, fighting for existence, and so on and so on. So this big gap of inequality in economical, technology, prosperity, quality, and the biggest gap of ideology acceptance of the world between these global South countries, including the Russia, China, India, and so on, and the West countries, is making a significant risk for the West of the losing of this geopolitical and geoeconomical competition on the next decades.
I think that that's right, with one proviso. I think on the political, in the geopolitical sense, I completely agree with this. But I think the idea of the enemy has shifted, to the cultural level, and the enemy there is the immigrant in the West. The response to Fukuyama's end of history argument was twofold. Normal sort of liberal realists, left and right, or I'm sorry, moderate realists, left and right, just blew it off and said, look, you're going to have political conflicts continue. Don't overestimate this current lull. There's still nations at war. There's still going to be fighting, so on and so forth. But there was another response, which I think became much more popular, and that was the response of Fukuyama's former teacher, and that was Samuel Huntington, whom you, of course, know. And Huntington's argument was that the new conflict is cultural. And what the United States has to do, in the first instance, we have to recognize and distance ourselves from Arabic societies. This became sort of whether fair or unfair, a legitimation for the Iraqi war. That is to say that, and the war on terror, again, for right or wrong. The basic claim was there are two civilizations involved. There's the West, there's the Orient, and the Occident. There's the Occident and the Orient. And never the twain shall meet. What's very interesting is, so this led to a demonization of all immigrants coming in from the Middle East. I think, by the way, that's true in Western Europe as well, and probably in Eastern Europe too. What's also interesting is that after the clash of civilization, Huntington wrote another book called Who Are We? And what that was an attack on immigration from the South, from Mexico and from Latin America. In other words, there was a desire to insulate American culture from groups that imperiled it. Basically, non-white, non-Christian, non-Protestant people with very different, or seemingly very different, civilizational roots. This gave rise to a kind of xenophobia, which, precisely because it wasn't political, it was cultural, sort of completely disoriented people disoriented the public, or parts of the public and parts of the political establishment, from the actual realistic options that faced the West when confronting those outside its borders. Did that make sense?
I want to just make a small remark here. You've mentioned that in the United States and in the Western Europe, the immigrants from the Middle East are demonized, and there is a cultural part, or there is a war between, like you've mentioned, the Protestant, the Christian Protestant, and the commerce from those parts of the world. And you also said that potentially in the Eastern Europe too. I've been in Eastern Europe many times, and I have lived there in short periods of time of months. I think the commerce from the Middle East are demonized in Eastern Europe, but for different reasons than the West. What would you say, Ruslan? What's the case in terms of the demonization of the foreigners, for example, in Ukraine, and just in general in the post-Soviet Union geographical landscape?
I want to turn this point from another side to we are living in a very geopolitical time, in very multicultural time, with the time of the very big influences of cultures of each other. But at the same time, if everything is smashing in the cultural way, that this cultural identity becomes a weapon, becomes an only one thing which is extremely important to build the new nation around it, to unite the people on some goals and so on. So from one side we have the time of smashing these cultures, geopoliticization of very open world, but at the same time we have the clashes of the cultures. We have the fights of regional elites, local elites, to combine, to strengthen their own cultural identity, to use it, to combine, to unite the people around it, to build the state, to gather the power in it. And we are living maybe in a new medieval time from this point of view. Two very contradictions process we have at the same time.
If I can say this is also a very good point. I think you see it in sort of macro terms. This is Make America Great Again. The Make America Great means, crudely speaking, there's an image of a golden age, which is carried on by the right, but not only, I think. It's an image of America that's stable, that's outside the multicultural world. It's an America in which women are in the kitchen, gays are in the closet, people of color are in the cotton fields, and if you like, immigrants are doing menial jobs if they exist at all. Russia, if you want to think about it in these terms, is perhaps also trying to recreate make itself great again by recreating the former Soviet Empire, or even looking back to the Russia. So you have that. I think that's right. Ruslan. Whether this is realistic is another matter, but I think that the idea of multiculturalism is not quite as ingrained as one might think. it is interesting that in the last election, Trump won, or shall we say, progressive forces lost among every segment of the American public. It wasn't just the traditional reactionary sections of the country and reactionary classes that were emboldened by Trump. He won even among women, white women. He won, numbers went up among Black men. Among Latinos, it was amazing how his numbers went up. That requires some explanation, because if it's true that multiculturalism is as hegemonic a force as we think, that shouldn't have happened. In short, there may be a residue that the real response to the collapse we've been talking about after the attack on the World Trade Center, the really dominant ideological force has been of the right. Has been of the polarized right, because it seems to be growing everywhere in response to sort of multicultural values and what are often multicultural illusions. Certainly considering.
If you allow me, I can see here two perspectives. From one perspective, you've mentioned that before, that the West is kind of, if I can say so, delusional in terms of how the world is operating at the moment, and in general since 2008 and 2011, with the events that we've had back then, in terms of the end of the history and in terms of their dominant power and how they're going to control the world and influence the world and resolve conflicts, etc., etc., etc. And that to me looks like a very naive perspective, and very, if I can even say, a weak perspective towards how to, operate things. From the other perspective, we can see a counteroffensive trend, as you just mentioned, that the far right ideology is kind of like the trend, and
fills the vacuum.
Yeah, the direction that fills up the vacuum, and just in general the direction that we're going for. And saying that and combining this together, how do we move forward from here into a situation where, from one side, we now have to somehow reduce or balance that far right trend, and from another perspective, the progressive power, as you've mentioned before, instead of being passive, they need to be proactive. Would you say that the conflicts that have happened since 2008 and since 2011, they have happened because from one side we have passive environment of progressive powers, and from other perspective we have this far right that just is happy to have those conflicts, not to solve them, but to become popular?
I think that's basically right. I basically agree with that. But when I say proactive, let me put it this way.
Yeah, what do you mean by proactive? That was my question. How they should be proactive? How do you see that? And how that proactive in general should look like?
Let me give 2 or 3 examples that maybe even Ruslan can expand on. The first thing is, I think any number of years ago, I actually wrote about this or mentioned this in a few articles. So if I thought of it, other people could have thought of it too. We see clearly 2 blocks forming, international blocks forming. One, we have the European Union, the United States, certain states in Latin America, essentially standing for traditional Western ideals. On the other hand, we have an authoritarian bloc forming. Russia, China, North Korea, potentially Pakistan.
What about Iran?
Iran, yeah, just occurring to me. And then, of course, also Hamas and Hezbollah, if you want to include them. We have done, I think the United States has not, I think the West has not done enough, and certainly not soon enough, to try and crack that block, turn Russia against China. You know, I've actually been very much in support of much of what President Biden has done. But in this regard, there's been a failure of American foreign policy going back to President Obama. And that is, we've now wound up in a situation where we're the enemies of Russia and we're the enemies of China. That is a diplomatic disaster. Here is a situation where the two could be turned against one another in any number of different ways. The United States is wound up in the bizarre situation of supporting the nuclearization of an increasingly ultra-nationalist Indian regime and an increasingly authoritarian Pakistani regime. One can't begin that way. In other words, there's been an inability to appreciate the role of this bloc. And instead of looking at the bloc, we're looking at individual nations. This, I think, is a mistake. We're in a transnational age, and I think Western foreign policy has to appreciate that and begin that way.
Can I ask you why they haven't yet? I mean, it's obvious that we have the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. We have, just like you said, the diplomatic disaster where Russia, China, Pakistan, and other countries that you've mentioned before are forming a bloc, and we should, or the West should view them as a bloc. Why haven't they yet, or they did?
These are questions, believe me, which are going around among critics in the States. I think one reason is because of the way that sort of politics is taught. We're taught about this as purely national phenomena, and this is something we should have realized actually after the Second World War, that more fully, that there are transnational trends which we have to take seriously. Let me give an example, because I was just in a discussion about this with a few friends who, how should I put it, are not intellectuals. They basically working people. And we were talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And he was saying, this is what made America special. Well, in a way, it certainly made America special relative to what it was before Roosevelt, who introduced basically the welfare state, as you know, with his New Deal. But actually, this was the American expression of the Popular Front in the 30s. It almost makes no sense to understand, to interpret Roosevelt's New Deal outside the anti-fascist Popular Front of the 30s that sort of was a defense of Republican ideals, and simultaneously an attempt to invigorate the welfare state. And the two were connected. So, for example, Leon Blum, who led the French Popular Front of the 30s. He was, after the fall of France, he was put on trial by the collaborationist Vichy regime. They couldn't find a real source of indictment. What they used was the following. Blum had introduced for the first time 2-week vacations and the 40-hour week. This was his Popular Front, anti-fascist coalition. He was put on trial by the collaborationist government because those two programs, the 2-week vacation and the 40-hour week, supposedly weakened the defensive capacities of France, and thus he was a traitor. Note how the welfare state and the economics of the welfare state and the politics come together in some way. You know, this kind of internationalization of politics, the idea of viewing international trends. I mean, there must be a way to talk about Trump emerging in the United States and this rise of ultra-right movements in Western Europe and to a degree in Eastern Europe as well. Does that make sense?
It does. I also want to add on that, and if Ruslan can help me, I have witnessed Ruslan not once, but multiple times having a conversation with international experts about the Russian-Ukrainian conflict from the perspective that the West is not viewing it as an international problem, but as a local conflict.
That is absolutely right.
And
but Russia came to Ukraine not for Ukraine.
For Ukraine, exactly.
But for the West. Russia came to Ukraine to make a strategic defeat for the West or United States interests in Europe, to redivide the zone of influence in Europe. The official Russian statements: we are not fighting with Ukraine and Ukrainians. They are just victims. They are tools in the Western hands, and so not more. We are fighting with the West. We are fighting with all the entire NATO countries. We are fighting with the United States. We are fighting with Japan, Australia, and so on, so on, so on. We're not fighting with Ukrainians. They are victims. So this is also as a big problem and big risk for the Western societies, non-recognizing this problem, because Russian society is fighting with the West. But West still is not recognizing that Russia is fighting with the West. And Russian society is very mobilized and very ready to make this, to multiply this war, to scale this war on another higher level, because they are ready for it. They are ready to, I'm talking about mental ready for it. They are ready to use the nuclear weapon. They are ready to use the power. They are ready to go to the Berlin again. The
way I mean, there's certainly a truth to that. The way this was laid out was twofold. From the standpoint of leftist critics, a number of my close friends of mine argue this. NATO under U.S. sponsorship was trying to provoke the Soviet Union into action by its overtures to Ukraine, and to bring Ukraine either or into NATO or into the European Union. Now, provocations obviously existed. On the other hand, here, I think Ruslan's completely right. If you poke the bear, it doesn't mean the bear has to immediately tear apart the person who's doing the poking. So that's one position. for the right, the argument was this is purely this is an example of the 1930s, and that if we don't stop Russia, we will engage in the same kind of appeasement that took place with Hitler and over Czechoslovakia in 1938, which may be a little much. I would shift this a little bit. I think Ruslan is correct with regard to this, to the way he laid this out within Russian society. My sense, though, I mean, I could be wrong, and I think it's true that it's not just Ukraine that's involved, and I think Russia sees the fight as a broader fight. But my sense is that one of the ways we might think about this is an attempt to sort of strengthen a bloc that was already forming among authoritarian regimes. In other words, there's a sense, in my view anyway, in which, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Putin saw that a rupture was taking place within the outside world, so to speak, and that, and certainly within the West, there was a weakness, and what that would logically lead him to do is try and build an authoritarian, strengthen the authoritarian bloc with China, with North Korea, so on and so forth. And the Trump regime certainly didn't counter this in any meaningful way, because it was already forming then.
Professor, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Does that
it does it makes good sense. I just want to lay it out in blocks, and just to conclude the points, talking with Ruslan and also hearing official statements from the officials of Ukraine, it seems to me like Ukraine and the Ukrainians understand that, I wouldn't call them victims, but they understand that Russia is not just fighting directly them, that Russia is fighting them because they have a broader strategy against the West. And that understanding is clear, and that understanding is clear to Ukrainians. I think that's why they resist any simple solutions. Like, they don't want a ceasefire because they understand that they will be at the loss side in any ceasefire that doesn't guarantee anything long term. They understand it, and they don't accept any small, quick solutions. That's from the Ukrainian side. And then if we look at Russia, China, Iran, all that bloc that is forming or formed and just needs to be strengthened, they also have a clear vision that they are fighting the West, that they're using the opportunity that they saw at 2008 and 2011 as the end of the history, that part. So they have a clear vision what they are aiming for, what they're here for, and therefore they're developing their own strategies. They might not be very productive, because we can see that in the Ukrainian case, they're far away from achieving whatever they were going for. And the only bloc that I want to elaborate a little bit more is on the Western bloc. And I want to use a part of the article that I've read that was wrote by you, Professor Bronner. Let me just find it. So it's a part of the site. I'll add a link into that, a full article, whoever wants to read it. This is just a part of it. Germany's Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck coined the famous phrase that politics is the art of possible. Political realism rests on that assumption. But the possible is not always self-evident. I want to add another part of that, but I want to stop here and just, ask you, and also give that a little entry. West is still a great power in terms of the economy, in terms of military, in terms of politics, in terms of all the resources that they have, human-wise, economic-wise, etc., etc., etc. So they do have a possibility to solve the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, to solve Middle Eastern conflict, to start new game in terms of, strengthening their bloc and coming to negotiations with the bloc that we can see that is forming on the east-south end. So my questions are, is it possible? If it is possible, why are they still in that, if we can call it, sleepy state, where they're still kind of like delusional, that they're still living in that frame of the end of the history, and they're not acting out, hey, we have problems to solve and they have to be solved, otherwise we're going to suffer consequences.
Let me see if I can put it this way. I'm not sure if following shall we say, making it contemporary right now with Trump coming into office, I'm not sure there actually is a grand idea at all. I think it's more or less ad hoc. However, if there is a grand idea, I think it is the following, that the United States wants to, is that Trump would be willing basically to sacrifice Ukraine in order to achieve some kind of reconciliation without confronting the authoritarian bloc. In other words, it would be give up Ukraine, position the United States as the dominant power concerned only with its own interest, and leave the authoritarian bloc to its own devices. This, I'm sure you've heard this term, America First, which is associated with Trump. This also goes back to the 1930s and what was an actual fascist movement in the United States. Its leader was Charles Lindbergh, or one of its leaders was Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator. And the basic argument was, at the time, the United States should withdraw from world affairs, leave Hitler to do what he does, break our alliance with England, which was seen as a weak sister, and just throw them to the wolves, and let Europe leave Europe to its own devices, set up the American fort or defend the American fortress. I think that's very much what Trump wants to do. It's sort of being anchored in the past, not looking to a transnational future.
But if I can, add a coin here, it's not just anchored in the past, because before we have discussed how the West is kind of like atrophied and they're being passive in terms of the world relations. So here, how it looks to me that Trump doesn't want to be passive about it. He wants to actively withdraw. Isn't that even worse?
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah, and it is worse.
It is worse.
It seems to me one of the things that the Russian-Ukrainian battle has shown is, for better or worse, the United States clearly has an important role to play in international affairs. And to be frank, among the left, and I see myself as aligned with the progressive community, there's an assumption which is very bad, which is carried over from the Vietnam time. And this is not usually said, but I think we can say it. there's this idea that because of America's imperialist past, or that strong strain of imperialism in America's past, anything which America is involved in must be bad. In other words, it's almost as if the progressive community can't deal with a situation where America, the United States, may be on the right side. Now, one can argue whether President Biden has handled this as deftly as he should have. That's open to debate. But that America should have come to the aid of Ukraine seems to me self-evident. Of course, he would come to the aid of a country which, for all its faults, still is basically democratic and which is being invaded by a dominant enemy of Western Europe and political enemy of Western Europe and the United States. I think it's intelligent that President Biden and NATO has not brought in its own troops. You want to contain the conflict, yes, but you also have to recognize that it's a conflict that impacts the rest of the world, and one has to
be a participant.
Yeah. But in Europe, it's really important, and in Ukraine also, it's really important to understand that you in Ukraine are facing a situation in which the right wants to basically withdraw, as you put it, James. The left is very, very suspicious of anything having to do with American involvement abroad. And the liberal, shall we say, unconditional support for Ukraine, which I think was never realistic to begin with. In other words, you just keep handing them cash without an actual strategy for peace. That's evaporating. That support is evaporating.
It's too passive.
I'm sorry? It's too passive, and it also it's, for example, this attempt by President Biden to give close to $4 billion now to Ukraine. This is clearly an attempt to strengthen Ukraine before President-elect Trump comes into power. And I understand it. It makes sense, but it's, shall we say, a tactic, not a strategy. One's still not clear where one's going.
Yeah, it's just you simply providing an extra buffer time before, like, you'll suffer consequences. Professor Bronner, I want to lay it out in 3 categories, and the third category is going to be actually a question: how do you see a third option, or like, a third stage, or a third option that we can play with here? And the first one is what we have witnessed for the past, if we can say, 10-15 years, where the West was kind of passive. If we can say that the West is the good guy, has its democracy, people in the West. Yeah, a better guy. Yeah, that's going to be a more a specific definition. A better guy, but that better guy has been behaving in the past 10, 15, or maybe even a little bit longer, in a more passive way. As you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, they have viewed world conflicts, world problems, world issues as bureaucracy issues, local issues that can be solved slowly without any direct intervenience or any, how should I say it, any direct attention or like any direct means to solve them. So we have been living in that phase where the better guy is just passive, is not reacting, is not planning to react, is trying to close.
It's passive in the transnational sense.
In the transnational, yeah. No, I'm not talking internal.
I mean, obviously, the United States has and Europe has engaged in support for Israel, has engaged in.
But it's part of their world.
Exactly, and the conflicts are, as you put it, are local and so on. They've given money, they've given advisors. All of this is true, but what has not been done is, I think, developing a proactive strategy for international authoritarian.
Resolving international conflicts, international issues.
As international phenomena. Yeah.
Right. So this is, if we can say, like, first option, and we've been living in that paradigm for 10, 15, 20 years. The second option that we can see right now that is rising with the president-elect Donald Trump that will get into the office in 2.5 weeks from now, it's a kind of like, we're not just going to passively not to participate, or like participate like, halfway or indirectly. We're just going to withdraw. We're going to go back. And then we're going to let the authoritarian regime get stronger or achieve their goals or whatever. And we'll try to negotiate with them certain deals, and we'll just play with them the game. So this is the second case that I can see unfolding now. And it seems to me that that's a very naive approach, because the American people, for example, now they're probably living in the paradigm that the Ukrainian conflict can be solved on the front line. Let's just freeze them. Let's stop sending them weapons.
I think it's a little different here, James. To my mind, the way it looks, I mean, one's totally unclear about anything other than unpredictability on Trump's part. But it seems to me it's possible to talk about two things. Trump is, in a way, perhaps trying to crack this authoritarian front. And the way by identifying with Putin on the Ukrainian issue, while engaging in this crazy tariff war with China. Now, this would be an attempt to sort of separate China from Russia, but in a really weird way, because if you're going to choose between those two nations as a political realist, you obviously want to quiet things down with China and Russia. But he's not doing that, at least so far. I mean, this can all change in the snap of a finger, and I don't want to do any predictions. This is just the way it looks now. As to an overarching strategy, though, again, with transnational situation, it's, as I suggested. In terms of local conflicts, it's what you suggested. It's the withdrawal. I mean, just with regard to Ukraine, it's basically indifference. I don't think it's the problem can be solved. It's almost like for much of America, I don't give a damn whether the problem can be solved. Just get us out. Don't spend any more money. Save the cash. It's in a certain way almost worse, because it's not even taking a position one way or the other. It's just stop spending the cash, let America withdraw.
And then it looks like the better guy is just simply giving up on its principles, ideologies, and ideas.
Yeah.
So
which would correspond with the domestic policy of Trump as well. Yeah.
I want to try and lay out with you a third option where the better guy is acting proactively on the transnational relationships, on the transnational issues, conflicts, wars, you name it. How do you think that better guy should behave on the Middle Eastern region, in the Russian-Ukrainian war, and just in general, how they should approach the challenges that we have in that new chapter after the end of the history? And clearly we can see that there is a new chapter unfolding where the West is still great, the West is still powerful, the West is still the better guy. I mean, right? We have court systems, we have welfare, we have career opportunities, education, and so on and so on and so on. Right? So how is this better guy should behave on all those issues that the better guy clearly either neglected or was not proactive enough to resolve them in the way that the better guy will remain the better guy and will help other parts that, clearly is under the Western influence or indirect control.
Okay, let me see if I can give 2 or 3 examples of how we might proceed. The first would be with regard to this international bloc. I think what strangely enough, one of the situations that it will emerge with, or has emerged already with Trump, is that the United States has actually distanced itself from NATO and the European Union. In other words, thus making an international strategy more difficult. The first thing is, I think, closing the gap is important, and emphasizing the need for a multilateral approach. I do think that that's still of great importance, and it's particularly important in, let's say, in the Middle East. There was a plan put forward by Saudi Arabia about 20, 30 years ago, which was basically a plan that a second state is created, just very crudely. Palestinian state is created, and in exchange, all the Arab states will recognize Israel and create some kind of diplomatic equilibrium with Israel. That's the kind of plan that I think is necessary. What Trump did the last time with the Abrahamic Accords was try and implement this without the Palestinian state. In other words, he just cut the Palestinians out, which I think had a great deal to do with October 7th, by building the frustrations. One has to be able to integrate, or one has to be able to use an international approach without forgetting the local problem, and using the international approach to try to resolve the local problem.
Say that he had a strategy, but he haven't had implemented tactics to fix the tactical issues.
Yeah, and there's and it's almost like let's immediately do what works, and to hell with the local issue in the Middle East, which can be self-defeating. The third thing I think at the moment is there has to be a new commitment to the United Nations as a source of building international unity and creating a space for at least the discussion of international issues. I see the UN as 3 things. One is the Security Council, which is where the real action is. That needs to be expanded, the number of states, and the veto format, whereby any state in the Security Council can veto anything that is proposed, that has to be changed as well. Expand it, mitigate the veto situation. Secondly, there's the General Assembly, which is actually, I think, a very, very positive structure, because it allows for an interchange between diplomats. It allows for personal interactions and gauging opponents and gauging friends, which I don't think exists anywhere else. And it also offers a vehicle to express international public opinion, which is becoming more and more important in a global age. Thirdly, and this is the most important for our discussion, there are the international agencies. We have to get to a point where we recognize that our national interest is in some way connected to international interests. And it's these international agencies, UNRWA, UNICEF, UNESCO, these organizations actually do things. I mean, if there are limits imposed, then they're imposed by nation states on the activities of these international agencies. The international agencies respond to disasters. They help nations and movements that are in desperate straits, for example, UNRWA and the Palestinians. And these you know about the World Health Organization and its role in dealing with pandemics and so on. One can keep going on here. But these agencies are being starved, are starved out.
In terms of
financing. And this is part of the Trump agenda. Here, Europe, East and West has to step in. I know that Western European nations have increased their funding participation for NATO and for organizations like that. But that's not enough. They have to do more. And there's no reason why they shouldn't do more. And that they are wealthy enough and they make enough use of international organizations that they have to step up. And so far they haven't done that. It's not just the United States. And I think that's, by the way, true of Eastern Europe too. There's no excuse for stepping back from international obligations. The more they are fulfilled, the more internationalism will become a serious option for dealing with the world's problems. So maybe that start.
Ruslan, would you add anything on that?
Yes, I'll try to add shortly. I'm absolutely agree with your professor, and but of course, in the ideal world, we could find a new kind of balance. Of course, it's a very, very brave, very, very honest, and very delightful goal. But I think it's very hard to find the balance now, and the previous balance made it after the Second World War is broken now. Also, so maybe the way how to resolve this issue for nowadays, it's to keep the door open on the West world. What do I mean? I mean that the West world is a welfare world. It's a very rich world. And I think a lot of fights, a lot of geopolitical conflicts around the West world, it's a conflict for the Western welfare, Western reach, and so on. So West may keep the doors open if we're talking about the NATO, if we're talking about the European and so on. Maybe the West could prepare another international organization or social economical system, which
That's pretty idealistic, right?
yeah, it's also idealistic also to keep this door open, because if these doors are closed, that authoritarian regimes are rising in this neglected part of the world, and later these authoritarian regimes, after armoring, weaponing, and so on, they're trying to break the walls of this world. They're trying to get inside of this world. I want to remind you only the Putin's history, who was a NATO supporter in the beginning of his presidential term. He wanted to bring the Russia to the NATO at the beginning. Then he wanted to bring the Russia to the European Union at the beginning. He wanted to have the land from the Vladivostok to Lisbon, to the Portugal. You remember the common economical lands and the system and so on. So, of course, it's one idealistic scenario against another idealistic scenario. We need to find the way how to open the door, not for the regimes, not maybe for entire elites, but for societies of this neglected world, how to become richer, how to become more prosperous. Of course, the West will sacrifice for it. Will sacrifice its own the level of prosperity for nowadays and so on. It will be decreasing in this process. It will be leveraging the world, balancing the world. But in the end, maybe we will obtain the global system, political and economical system. Yes, global state. I am supporter of the global state because I think it's a very necessary way for human being to gather all the resources for resolution of our real global problems, starting from the climate changes and in the discovery of the space and so on and so on.
And evolutionally, we were moving in that direction where we started as a tribe, then we formed a village, then we formed a town, then we formed a country, then we had.
Well, this was the great Enlightenment vision of Kant, that you have an international federation of states. I have one other thing though to leave you with, which is something we don't look at enough. And this is something I learned about in Africa. There are not just international organizations or large transnational organizations and nation states. There are these intermediate organizations. I'm not even sure what to call them. Let me give you an example. We went to my organization, the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue. We were invited to Guinea for to advise on their university system, which we happily did. On the way, we went from Mali to Senegal and Guinea. And these are very poor countries. And they're separate countries. There are borders if you go from one to the other, but you would be incapable of telling the difference between one state and the other if you're an outsider. Now, one of the things we noticed was beyond the national government, but not recognized by other political international bodies, there was an organization, Noordine it's called, which was at once theological, political, and social, which bound people together within these different nations, and which had incredible impact. I mean, we were, Eric Goslin and my co-director and I, we were completely shocked by the influence of this kind of organization. And I think we have to look for them. We haven't been doing that. There are these things around these type of overlooked, not quasi-political formations that might serve our purposes. They could be in the form of churches. They could be in the form of educational organizations. The Enlightenment had an idea of what they called the Republic of Letters, which was international in character, or transnational in character. I think we have to look for these organs of international civil society, let's call it, that might help the project that Ruslan's talking about.
I like that perspective where potentially the solution, how to form new relationships and new rules and laws for how to solve international, transnational conflicts can be potentially hidden somewhere in the world, and we don't have to invent them, but just look into them and see.
Exactly. We have to be more innovative and think a bit more outside the box, I think.
Professor Bronner, thank you so much for joining us today. We were honored to have you and to have this discussion with you. We will add links into your articles. And just again, Professor Bronner is a political scientist, philosopher, and the director of the Global Relations for the Center Study of Genocide and Human Rights. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. And thank you to you both. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.